welcome. Thank you all for being here today. My name is Lila Sattler, and I'm a sophomore at Bryn Mawr College. I'm from San Francisco, and at Bryn Mawr, I'm completing a double major in political science and sociology with a minor in Italian studies. This semester, under the guidance of Professor Alessandro Gemay, I completed an independent research project focused on charting the history of the Italian Studies Department and of the Italian language at Bryn Mawr College. Today, I will present with you all what I learned. My research project began with a question posed by myself and Professor Gemay. What is the history of the Italian Studies Department at Bryn Mawr College? More specifically, when was the language first taught at the college? How has the department and the course offerings changed over time? What individuals were and have been important in shaping the Italian Studies Department? We decided that this was worth spending time investigating, as relatively little was known and was readily available about the history of Italian at Bryn Mawr. Professor Gemay created a syllabus for potentially the smallest Bryn Mawr class ever offered, the course roster consisting of myself and Professor Gemay, and I got to work. I began with the Bryn Mawr Digital Archives, combing through the college's annual programs, searching for mentions of the Italian Studies Department and their course offerings. I began with the oldest annual program that I could find, from 1883, which provided my first glimpse into the roots of the Italian Studies Department. I discovered that there were very few courses offered in the early years of the department. The associate professor of all three Romance languages was in charge of the Italian department, and the courses were listed as a subheader of the Spanish department. It was clear that Italian studies was not originally a highly prized or well-staffed department at Bryn Mawr. I examined the annual reports for each year from 1883 to 1894, which comprised the first groups of programs available digitally, spanning the early years of Bryn Mawr's existence. There was relatively little information about the Italian Studies Department and their courses listed in the early annual programs, and thus there were limited takeaways to be made, but not none. For example, my research revealed that the early second-year Italian literature courses focused on the writings of Petrarch, Boccaccio, Manzoni, and Leopoldi. In 1891, the second-year language courses listed as discussing the Divina Commedia and the Via Nuova of Dante, to be preceded by readings in the Sonetti and Canzoni of Petrarch and Orlando of Ariosto. Other readings that the early Italian classes focused on include Dante's Paradiso, Ariosto's Orlando Furioso, one representative drama from the works of Goldoni, Alfieri, and Manzoni. There are a few interesting things to note about these works. First, Alessandro Manzoni passed away only a decade before his works were first taught at Bryn Mawr College. Thus, these teachings are very contemporary in their time. It is worth noting that some of the works taught in the early years of Bryn Mawr have stayed relevant enough to be taught today. 150 years later, Professor Roberta Ricci of the current Italian Studies Department teaches courses on Boccaccio regularly. Other works, such as Alfieri and Goldoni, are ancient relics in terms of being taught at Bryn Mawr. They did not pass the test of time as staples of Italian culture or literature, as Boccaccio and others did. Finishing the first set of annual programs, from 1883 to 1894, I decided that it would be prudent to move to examining one annual program per decade to both see the changes over time to the department, but also to ensure that I didn't spend the entirety of my semester on the early phases of research. This proved fruitful. I was able to observe large changes over time to the Department of Italian Studies. Starting in 1904, a complete list of Bryn Mawr College students was included in each year's program, making it easier to record and keep track of the students studying Italian at Bryn Mawr. 1904 was also the first year in which I found graduate courses in Italian listed, covering topics like philosophy, poetry, prose literature, and old readings. The 1945 program, which I used as I was unable to find the 1944 program digitally, was the first time that the Italian course offerings were listed in a way most recognizable to those of us attending Bryn Mawr today, as a list of classes and the topics covered in each course, along with the corresponding level of the class, 100 level, 200, or 300. Some notable professors from the department that I came across in my research include Nancy Dersofi, Angeline Lagrasso, and Nicholas Petruno. These individuals are largely responsible for establishing the legacy of success that the Italian department at Bryn Mawr today has both benefited from and that its current students and professors continue to work to uphold. At this point, I switched gears. Since the inception of my research project, Professor Jamay and I had been interested in the relationship between Hafner Hall and the Italian Studies Department. For those of you who are not familiar, Hafner Hall was a dormitory at Bryn Mawr from 1971 to 2012, which once stood where New Dorm stands today. Many people know that Hafner served as affinity housing for language majors on campus, but few know the specifics of its history and organization. Hafner was built as a result of a large donation made to the college by Charles C. Hafner in honor of his late wife, Clarissa Donnelly Hafner, an alumna of Bryn Mawr's class of 1921. Charles Hafner wanted to provide a new dormitory space for students that were dedicating their time at Bryn Mawr to studying foreign languages. Hours spent in the archives of Canada Library and correspondence with library staff and archivists proved fruitful in uncovering more information about Hafner. The dorm was originally intended to house students studying French, German, and Spanish. A series of letters sent between President Catherine McBride of Bryn Mawr and Ms. King, the head of the Center for Hispanic Studies in Madrid, provided insight into the decision as to which languages would be housed in Hafner and which would not. In her letter to President McBride, Ms. King expresses her excitement for the creation of a language-centric dormitory, but also expresses her concerns. She asks, how, incidentally, are Russian and Italian going to feel about not having a specific place set aside for them in the house? Can something be done to soothe feelings there? In her response, President McBride contends that since Russian and Italian have no continuing interest in a language house, nor a continuing student group, I think it would be better for them to take one of the other language houses from time to time as they might need it. By one of the language houses, Professor McBride is referring to a small variety of other language-centric housing options that Bryn Mawr has possession of. This includes Batten House, which was used as a Russian language dormitory, and Wyndham Alumni House, which for a time was inhabited by students studying French. The use of space to create community within Hafner was another interesting aspect of the dorm uncovered by archival research. I learned that Hafner Hall was built to resemble a European village, with each language's tower connecting into a courtyard where students from the different language wings could come together and partake in a larger language hall community. These are some of the images of Hafner that my research uncovered. The type of research that I engaged in when looking into Hafner Hall was diametrically opposed to the nature of the work that I'd previously done with the annual programs. Then I knew that information about the Italian Studies Department and their course offerings existed within the online archives. It was simply a matter of finding them and looking through them. While it was time-consuming and perhaps slightly tedious at times, it was consistently productive. I never feared that I was wasting my time, that I wouldn't find what I was looking for. It was a very low-risk, high-reward, structured type of research. Researching Hafner was quite different. Unlike before, where I knew exactly where to look, I had no idea where or how to begin this research. Professor Jamay and I had originally planned to look into Hafner from the student perspective. We wanted to know what students who lived in Hafner had to say about the dorm, about the language community that it created. Well, I successfully found information about the history, creation, and layout of Hafner. I was relatively unsuccessful in finding student perspectives on the building. Professor Jamay's original plan centered on using backsmoker diaries as a source of student impressions and opinions, but we were soon informed that Hafner Hall did not have backsmoker diaries. I decided to search through the BICO newspapers from the years in which Hafner existed, looking for op-eds or other articles about the language house, but I found nothing. The sole student opinion on Hafner that I uncovered was from the Canada Archives, titled Culture and Language Alive and Well in in Special Houses. This article, published in 1992, centers around the language houses of Bryn Mawr, Batten House for Russian, Hafner, and an Erdmann Chinese language hall. While the piece speaks positively about Batten and Erdmann's successes as language-centric spaces, it is more critical of what it sees as Hafner's limited effectiveness. The article contends that while the majority of the upperclassmen who drew into Hafner via Bryn Mawr's room draw process had some ability in the language of the wing they were to live in, some students did not. Through the women's room draw option, students who didn't speak a foreign language were allowed to move into Hafner as well. A first-year resident of Hafner French is quoted as saying that Hafner is excess sophomore housing. The article goes on to state that some Hafner residents feel that because not all students in the dorm actually speak the language of their wing, Hafner has lost its function as a language dorm. Now, there may have been multiple reasons for the severely limited discovery of student perspectives on Hafner Hall. My access to the BICO newspapers was somewhat limited, as many newspapers from the years in which Hafner was in operation were not available digitally. It was also incredibly time-consuming to comb through the monthly BICO news publications for multiple years. If a keyword search feature had been available, I believe this phase of my research would have been significantly more productive. It was in this moment that the works of Italian theorist Carlo Ginzburg became relevant to my life, something that I never imagined myself saying. Part of Professor Gemmay's syllabus consisted of the readings of Radici di un paradigma indizzario, an essay by Italian theorist Carlo Ginzburg. Professor Gemmay and I had previously dedicated time to ensuring my understanding of Ginzburg's arguments, which were limited by the complex, nuanced, and vocabulary-heavy theories expounded upon in Italian by Ginzburg. I had originally walked away from the essay feeling confused and somewhat defeated in my Italian comprehension skills. In this moment, coming out of the archive relatively empty-handed, confused as to the lack of information that I'd uncovered, I was able to connect Ginzburg's theory of the archive to my own firsthand experiences. Ginzburg proposes a potentially atypical way of looking at an archive. He argues that an archive is not a retelling of a historical event or a time period akin to a history textbook, but rather is a constructed compilation of resources that can aid in one's understanding of history. The documents and resources that make up an archive can and have been interpreted differently by different individuals over time to create stories and narratives about what they believe happened in the past, what they believe to be the story that the archive is telling. Ginzburg points out that there is no innate story being told by the archive, that one must go into archival research with an idea in mind, a potential narrative that they are looking to flesh out, that the archive can provide documentation, either proving or disproving. However, there's also a fine line that one must walk between letting one's theory lead to confirmation bias and between letting the vast amounts of information within the archive distract one from their thesis. I entered the archive with a theory that Hafner Hall had made a significant impact on the lives of Bryn Mawr students studying foreign languages, and that it was an often discussed and praised resource for language learning students. I did not find evidence of that in the archive. Rather than convince myself that I was looking in the wrong place, that if I had more time, I would have found more positive student reviews of Hafner, I had to come to terms with the most likely answer, what the archive was trying to tell me. Perhaps Hafner was not a central part of Bryn Mawr. Perhaps Italian was not a central part of Hafner. Perhaps Hafner did not have the incredible impact on the language learning communities at Bryn Mawr that I believed it had. Maybe students did not look extremely fondly or negatively upon Hafner. Maybe Hafner just existed, and few students felt strongly enough about its existence to write opinion pieces about the building that were likely to make it into the archive or the BICO newspapers. Rather than be disappointed or continue to berate myself for a lack of discovery, a lack of conclusions, I followed Ginzburg's advice and listened to the archive. Because sometimes what isn't in the archive tells as much of a story as what is. The last stage of my research consisted of an in-depth linguistic, context and content-based analysis of a document from the Italian Studies department that I felt was both relevant and illuminatory to the research that I had been completing all semester. The document that I chose to analyze was from the papers of Angeline Lagrasso, one of the notable professors from the Italian Studies department whom I identified through my early exploration of the annual programs. The paper that I chose to analyze was an Italian letter in a series of 1932 correspondences between Professor Lagrasso and Professoressa Maria Castellani, the president of the National Confederation Trade Union for Professionals and Artists. This is just a close-up of the previous document. Now, in this letter, Castellani writes fondly to Lagrasso, discussing both her memories of Lagrasso visiting Rome and of her own time at Bryn Mawr. They discuss research grants for students at Bryn Mawr who want to study in Europe, and the existence of a student from Smith College who had studied with Castellani in Italy. Castellani discusses wanting a closer working relationship with Lagrasso and Bryn Mawr, proposing that she and Lagrasso keep each other updated on how their respective works are progressing. I was interested in this letter in particular because I felt that it demonstrated some of the early roots of what Bryn Mawr considers to be an important and valuable part of its identity, its status as an internationally recognized and internationally connected school. By this, I mean that Bryn Mawr prides itself on its relationships that exist between the college and various institutions of higher learning around the world and professors from those institutions. The relationship between Lagrasso and Castellani is one example of this early internationalism that in modern times is an important component of Bryn Mawr's identity. It is one of the many reasons why students may choose to attend Bryn Mawr. This letter shows that Professor Lagrasso was both an important figure to the Italian Studies Department at Bryn Mawr and also an important figure to the international Italian community beyond Bryn Mawr's walls. I also found it worth noting that these letters were sent at a unique moment in world and Italian history. As Italy was under a totalitarian dictatorship at the time, it is interesting to note that Bryn Mawr affiliated faculty were in cordial contact with openly fascist individuals and institutions, who, despite also possessing a feminist cause, one would expect the college and individuals associated with the college to not have such a friendly and cooperative relationship with. This raised questions in my mind as to Bryn Mawr's apparent tolerance of relationships with fascist institutions. Was the nature of the working relationship between Lagrasso and Castellani the norm or a unique instance? Because my research project only spanned one semester, I didn't have the time to find all of the answers that I was looking for or explore all of the pathways that I was drawn towards researching. For any student or faculty interested in continuing research into the history of the Italian Studies Department, there are multiple ways that one could continue to build on the research that I began this semester. One could finish going through each of the Bryn Mawr annual programs, making a complete timeline of the Italian courses and professors at Bryn Mawr since the college's inception. One could analyze documents of all the great Italian professors over the department's history, a larger scale version of my analysis of Angeline Lagrasso's letter. For Professors Petruno and Dersofi, who both passed away relatively recently, one could compile oral testimonials from students who studied under them at Bryn Mawr and who remember their teachings, the lessons that they imparted upon their students. In fact, there will be a symposium held next year in honor of Professor Petruno, which is a promising opportunity to gather information and insight for a future research project into the late professor. Lastly, an interesting line of research regards Bryn Mawr's relationship with fascist institutions, perhaps looking for more documents of Castellani, whom Professor Lagrasso was in communication with. It would be very interesting to identify what was the perspective of the college and of the Italian Studies Department on relationships with fascist institutions and individuals. It would also be interesting to see how this opinion changed over time as a result of the changing situation in Italy and across the globe. If anyone has any questions about pursuing one of these or another avenue of research, I'd be more than happy to provide my insight or to further share what I've learned from my research. This concludes my semester's worth of research mapping the history of the Italian Studies Department at Bryn Mawr. I thoroughly enjoyed my time working as a research assistant under the tutelage of the inspiring Professor Jamé, whom I would like to take a moment to give a special thanks to. Professor Jamé's endless support, out-of-the-box ideas, and ability to make the most daunting Italian literature that I've ever approached accessible were all instrumental in making this research project possible and ensuring that it ran smoothly. I'm eternally grateful to have completed my first archival research project under such a dedicated, inspiring mentor. The research skills that Professor Jamé has imparted upon me will be invaluable to my future research endeavors. I would like to thank Joseph Mara, Jeffrey Cohen, and Allison Mills for their time and assistance with accessing archival documents and for providing suggestions for new avenues of research. My thanks extend to Roberto Ricci, Chiara Benetolo, Pamela Pizzone, and the Italian Studies Department for creating a home, a welcoming community for myself and other Italian language learning students here at Bryn Mawr, and for igniting my passion for Italian. Thank you.
I wish everyone could be in the room with us now and applaud Lila for this wonderful piece of research. I think it's such. I hope everyone is hearing me. What is really amazing about this is that I think people like Nancy Dersofi, people like Nick Patruno would be so happy to see that the legacy of the department is students at the very beginning of their trip through Italian and Italian studies are able to read Carlo Ginzburg, which I, as a graduate student, had and a native Italian speaker, had a hard time working with, and making use of these ideas, making use of this language that is so hard to negotiate with a very hard research that led to so few documents, and a completely different research, the one with Lo Grasso and Castellani, that instead was so fruitful and rich. And I think it is amazing, like your research got to this central point that is super important for any future endeavor, which is the relationship with the negotiation with the fascist past of Italian history, since Maria Castellani apparently was the one who founded the Italian club at Bryn Mawr, and she was a fascist woman mathematician. And Angeline Lograsso, who collaborated with her, then became an anti-fascist intellectual, which is, it's incredible. We always think of this history as a very clear black and white thing, and instead it's so nuanced. Every year changes, and especially if you look at it from a transatlantic perspective, it becomes very difficult to analyze in simple terms, and your terms were not simple at all. So grazie, Lina, this is wonderful. So I think we can open to questions. I think, Lila, you can stop sharing. Do you see where?
I'm looking.
Yeah, you go.
Grazie.
Ecco qua. Perfetto. In Italian we say il bello della diretta, which means this is the joy of doing things live. And there are 3 people in the room and 17 people online, and I think we're ready to take questions. And also just celebratory happiness. That is also welcome. See, there's a question from Professor Cast. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to bring the computer close so everyone can hear.
Good. Well, thank you very much. I have some questions, but I also have one detail. Lily Ross Taylor, who was in the Latin department, had very complicated relationships with fascist Italy. And I'm trying, the details escape me at the moment.
I think she was with the Rome Prize. No?
That's right, yes.
Academy.
Corey Brennan, who now teaches at Rutgers University, he gave a talk about that.
Amazing.
So you should make contact with him. He taught here, so he'll be very friendly. The other detail, the art history department, which is what I'm representing at the moment, that the first courses taught in that department were done by Georgiana Goddard King, who was in the Spanish department. And the other courses were on Japanese art. And I've always found that very interesting when you think of the history of the United States, that Spanish and Japanese were the areas first studied. I have then one more question for all of you. When were Italian departments established in American universities? Because in England, University College London, I think, was in the 1840s, down to Gabriel Rossetti's father. Yeah. So I was just wondering, when Johns Hopkins, when was that founded? Do you know?
Probably, yes, in the 19th century.
Okay, yes.
But later, I think that our department in Bryn Mawr is one of the oldest.
Is it really? Yes.
It is. It's not the oldest. I think the oldest is Columbia.
Okay.
But I think Bryn Mawr College is peculiarly early, as and that might be related with the Italian population of Bryn Mawr in Philadelphia.
Would it really? Yeah.
But also, I think with the this is something that Lila and I have been talking about. What does Italian mean in the 19th century for the education of young women? And what is the, in fact, one thing that Lila noticed is that so many scientists went from here to Rome. after graduating. Maria Castellani connection was with math. So how Italian was part of an appropriate kind of, right?
Absolutely.
Sí, and that's what I knew myself. Thank you, Professor Katz.
Well, I mean, I know what in England what Italian meant was, you know, Pisa, reading Giorgio Vasari, you know, and once the train system was set up in Italy, young women from England went all the time and produced translations of Italian texts. That would be the same here, right? I mean,
I believe so.
Yeah.
I believe so. But I also think that there is less of a grand tour kind of,
yes,
and more of a local Italianness
that's
that mattered more.
Yeah, yeah. Because French, I guess, was the first language that young English women studied. But then I think Italian would be, they wouldn't have studied Spanish. No.
Not back then.
You think of the political situation.
And yet Lila noticed that the first courses of Italian were under the wing of the Spanish department.
Yes. Because here the Spanish department was very strong, I think, fairly early on. And Georgiana Goddard King was a very well-known figure on the Bryn Mawr campus. In art history, she's just interested in Romanesque art.
That's so interesting. That's a very peculiar Bryn Mawr thing.
Yeah, she traveled around Spain in her car, you know, looking at, you know, the route to Santiago de Compostela.
So weird. Thank you, Professor Katz. This is wonderful.
Great stuff.
And we have Chiara Benetollo, whom, let's see.
Hi.
Yes. Chiara.
Can you hear me? Yeah, awesome. So I mostly have a celebratory remark with a little bit of a question. So first I want to say that this work was really, really interesting. I think as someone who loves working in the archives, it was, I don't know, emocionante to see how you dug into the history of this institution, dug old letters and not just stopped and looking at what the history was, but also thought about what it means to work in an archive, and the part about how to, I found in my experience as well that often the moments when the archive disappoints us are the moments that are actually the richest ones, because they push us to interrogate our own preconceptions and our own hypothesis. And like you, I think that kind of the silence of the students on this college, Hafner is called? Yes, on Hafner is especially telling. And I'm absolutely convinced by your analysis, by the way you brought in Ginsburg. I also wonder whether, and I don't know if this is something you had looked into, so if you have an answer for that, I wonder whether that also speaks to more broadly to how much student voices were represented in those earlier documents, right? So it looks like from the documents that you presented, and I'm sure that this was a selection of what you actually found, that there were actually a lot of institutional conversations on like the structure of the college, and not as many student voices. So I don't know if it was because students were actually not talking about it as much, or was it because they were not talking about it in the documents that are available in the archives? So I'm going to stop here. But thank you again. This was really, really amazing.
Thank you so much, Professor Essa. So glad to have you here today. That's a great question. And I actually did note that in my research, looking at the proposals from Charles Hafner to the architect of Hafner to the president of Bryn Mawr, there were no student opinions to be found. It was just a conversation between adults from these different institutions. And my guess about that is that Bryn Mawr wasn't interested in giving students a lot of input in the design of the building, as disappointing as that might be. I did find some interesting documents in which I believe it was the architect, it might have been the president of the college as well, were suggesting interesting additions to the building, like adding in a small theater for language, video, and theater conversations within Hafner. And it was shot down by Charles Hafner, who paid for the dorm because he wanted it to be primarily a living space, not an academic space as well. And that was something that I thought was interesting, because I think that if students had been interviewed and had their opinions heard, they probably would have supported resources like that. So no, there were no student perspectives that I could find about the building of the building, which I presume is reflective of Bryn Mawr's, valuing of sort of adult opinions more than students when it comes to things like, the construction of $1 million building.
Could I add one more detail?
1 second, we have Allora. We have.
Oh, sorry.
I just wanted to thank Dr. Benetolo, and it totally makes sense. It's so interesting to see the generational expectations, now how one relates with the archive. Student of your generation would expect, and I actually, as a professor of this generation, would expect to find more student consultants in this kind of things. And instead, it shows you how this changed, of course. We have a question from Michael Sattler, and then we'll circle back to Professor Cast.
Hi, well, first I wanted to start off with congratulations. It was a fascinating talk. Clearly, tuition money well spent. My question primarily is, did you find any video archival footage? And is it possible to persuade you to do a presentation just like this one solely on the photos and any video you might have found? Because that would be fascinating. And if I can pile more research work on you, another talk about the whole slant of fascism, Bryn Mawr, Spanish and Italian during the Second World War would be really interesting to me. And again, Lila, congratulations.
Thank you so much. Thank you for all of your questions. I may forget some of them, but in my research, I began by looking for images of Hafner, because when I first came to the college and learned about Hafner before starting this research project, I was interested in seeing what it looked like. And I was surprised to find that when you Google Hafner Hall, Bryn Mawr College, a total of 2 photos come up, and they're both grainy and really hard to see. And so I was interested in figuring out why that was. And so one of the primary goals of looking at Hafner, for me at least, within the subheader of House Space Trades Community, was looking at how Hafner was organized. And so I found more photos than the ones that I displayed today, but not many. For some reason, there is a severely limited amount of photos of Hafner that I could find in the Bryn Mawr digital archives. I did not find any video content. I didn't explicitly look for it, but when I did type in Hafner and scrolled through the pages of digital photos, there wasn't anything video-wise available. But I did have access to the blueprints of Hafner, which I thought was really interesting, because from that aerial perspective, you can really see where the architect was coming from in terms of the separate wings creating their own communities, but also the communal spaces for, the larger European village, if you will, to interact with each other. So I would be interested in continuing research and looking into photo and video documentation of Hafner. I could definitely present on that in the future if this is the first of many research projects. And I'm also interested as well, which I touched on regrettably briefly in my presentation, on the relationship between fascism, Bryn Mawr, and Italian and Spanish history. I think that's definitely a bit of a can of worms to open. Angelina Grasso, whose letter I presented on, there were actually 3 boxes worth of information, worth of her letters in the archive. So I think there's definitely an abundance of information there, and that could be a great jumping off point for myself or for anyone else interested in charting that history, which would also be great to have a presentation about.
And if I can share with everyone one of the conversation that we had, Lila, that was really interesting. When you came up with, you were worried about not finding what we wanted to find, which was like something like a lot of images, a lot of videos. What's the life of people, of students living in Hafner and speaking Italian all day? Not finding that, I remember when you realized how the archive shapes history, how much the institutional and architectural reality of this relatively short-lived place in the college makes us able only to remember and to talk about that aspect of it. And I think you did a great job explaining that when you connected it to Ginsburg. We have Professor Kast.
This is a very trivial and minor point, but when I was first introduced to Bryn Mawr, they gestured towards Hafner and says, "Doesn't that remind you of San Gimignano?" Because it had two towers.
Really? Can we quote you on that?
Yes.
That's very relevant information. Because one thing that Lila and I were wondering about is like this quote that she found, which was like a European village.
Yes.
And we were like, this looks like a futuristic, cool place, not a European village. But instead, you know, the perception of San Gimignano. That's amazing. See, Professor Ricci, I'm going to bring you the computer.
Così saluto tutti. Ciao a tutti. First of all, Lila, thank you again so much for what you have done. This has been an amazing research, a research that was never done within our department. And we are really excited to bring this research to our symposium next spring dedicated to Professor Patruno. And I see that Edwina is with us. So Edwina, tanti abbracci. So thank you very much. And of course, a big thank you also to Alessandro, who has so patiently during such a difficult year helped you and guided you and enlightened you. So thank you both very much. So I wanted to start to go back a little bit to Ginsburg, since like Alessandro said, you know, even native speakers, Italian graduate students, when we were assigned Ginsburg, we, you know, used to pull our hair for those who have hair.
Exactly.
And
that's how I lost my hair.
So I wanted to ask how much Ginsburg and his very sophisticated way of thinking and prioritizing details, right? So Ginsburg is amazing in constructing and explaining his theories of looking at details, look at tracce, look at indizi in art history, right? Don't look at the smile, don't look at the hair, look at the little, le orecchie, bravissima, l'unghia, right? So how did you reconcile that that the attention of the small details within the totality? Because for me has always been very challenging. At some point, okay, I got it, I look at the details, but how does it fit within the whole totality? So that's one question. I think the second question really is the same question, because it brings me, it's another way to put it. So the relationship, it's always very difficult within any research, but especially as your first archival research, between theory and practice, right? How do we jump from one to the other without really losing the whole picture? And in that regard, you know, so Ginsburg on one hand, and on the other hand, Alessandro, how did they both help you to navigate this huge, you know, totality, and at the same time look at those small details which we didn't know about? And I agree that it will be fantastic to carry on. I hope, you know, some of the students who are here, you know, I see Kyle, Elisa, etc., may want to write a thesis, or maybe you decide to write a thesis, because it will really be worth it to look at the relationship, especially within the fascist area. So grazie mille, Lila.
So to answer your first question, Professor Ricci, For those who haven't read Ginsberg, he spends a lot of his time explaining the way that he thinks an individual should approach an archive. And he relates it to the work of Sherlock Holmes, of an investigator, of someone who looks at an objective situation that many others are also looking at, trying to make sense of, but who goes deeper and looks at very specific details to help them understand what's really going on and what you can't see from just a first glimpse. And one really helpful analogy that he provides is in looking at the true authorship of different pieces of art, and how when looking at the image overall, quickly, two might look like exact replicas. They were both made by Michelangelo. They look so similar. But when you hone in on the smaller details, not necessarily the face, the eyes, the body, but the ears, the fingers, small details that are harder to replicate to perfection and that you're also spending less time replicating to perfection, that's when you find out the true story of both those images, but in a larger sense of the archive. So to answer both of your questions in one, I think I was really lucky because I was provided a lot of structure from both Alessandro and Ginsberg. It didn't feel like I necessarily had to do that level of checking on the ears, checking out the pieces of hair, really trying to uncover hidden narratives, because the narratives that I was looking for were hidden from the public through just being in the archive and not having already been told. But once I looked for them, they were there. So in a sense, it felt like there was one less layer that I had to do, if that makes sense. Once I found the information, it told me the story. I didn't have to further debunk what story that information was also concealing. But I did sometimes. For example, in the letters between Ms. King and President McBride of Bryn Mawr, the fact that we get quotations like, "How will the Italian Studies Department feel about not being given a house?" And the fact that the president responds and says, in what I consider to be, a bit of a snippy tone, maybe, well, they don't have a large student group, they don't have continued interest, and they can have some other house. So reading into tone, into what isn't said, I think was my version of looking at the ears, being an investigator. And I think that it was also really interesting to have Alessandro on one shoulder and Ginsberg on the other, because sometimes their goals didn't align, their ideas, crisscrossed. And so I sort of saw it as walking along a path, taking the different pieces of information that I found relevant to guide me forward, but having Alessandro next to me explaining, this is the strategy that I recommend. And you're not finding this here, but what sort of Alessandro speaking Ginsberg's words to me. And so I think it was definitely a back and forth of leaning more towards Alessandro's side of the research of, let's look for backsmoker diaries, let's find this, then going into it and not finding it, and then going back to Ginsberg and saying, what does he say about this? How does his theory either conflict or further what we were trying to do? So a bit of an angel devil situation, but Alessandro being the angel, of course. Yeah, it was not too difficult, and I'm grateful that I wasn't analyzing historic pieces of art and that I had a bit of an easier, more objective time finding what I was looking for.
If I can add something to that, I must say that it was super easy to teach this independent study because Lila is gifted with a great intellectual maturity and a great curiosity. I personally, like, the goals of this class for me were mostly about phase 1 and phase 4 of our research. So, let's see, when did we start? Who were the professors? How many? And then, let's see, Angeline Lograsso, this great name, so many papers. And Lila instead was very curious about Hafner. I personally did not care at all about Hafner College, but when a researcher has a true curiosity, and even when, and this was the case, even when the material, the ruins, the relics, and the tracce, and the spies, and all those things are not abundant, it is always worth going through a research. And tonight you showed us how and why. I would say that whoever, whatever kind of endeavor that requires this kind of skills you will find in the future, always trust this strong curiosity, because it yields results even when it's not what you're originally asked to do, even when there's not like an obvious material to go through. And it is something that can generate the kind of research that is the most original, because nobody's thinking about it. And that's what originality is in history. So this was really great. I'm very happy and proud. Are there any? Oh, I have a chat message. See, there are nice chat messages that we have. That you were an excellent Sherlock. Wonderful. So if we're done with our conversation, I think we will continue an in-person celebration of Lila, possibly outdoors. And I wanted to thank very much everyone for coming, friends and members of the Department of Italian and Italian Studies. And I wanted to say ciao to everyone and give everyone a date, un appuntamento for next year, exactly next year, when we're going to gather again. And this pilot research is gonna be the really the beginning, the stepping stone to a wider reflection about our past for the symposium in honor of Professor Nick Petruno that really inspired this whole endeavor. Thank you, Lila. Thank you, Professor Ricci. Thank you, Professor Cast, and thank you all for coming. Have a good afternoon. Ciao.